Mamay, La Paz, o Chuquiago Marca Manta, Papay, o Tatay, Cochabamba Manta. So, hello, how are you all? My name is New Amauta. I also My actual name is Arnold. Um, my family is from Bolivia, and my mom's from La Paz, and my dad's from Cochabamba. I introduced myself in Quechua just because I want to respect the language that my father passed down to me. That would have been lost had I not searched out language lessons in a Quechua teacher during my college years. But I think it's only appropriate for an indigenous podcast to introduce oneself in an indigenous language. So, hello, how are you all? So, I'm New Amauta. I'm the creator of the Instagram page in New Amauta, which is an inter-indigenous hemispheric page that should be run by multiple people, but it's run only by me, where I do analyses, book quotes, book reviews of indigenous materials from across the continent, primarily in English and Spanish. So I'll do everything from reviewing the Red Nation and then comparing it with Evo Morales' project to studying the plurinational movement in Guatemala, and then maybe comparing that with the plurinational movement in Peru, both of which are not complete nor but are on the move, so to say. Uh, the whole point of the project was that I didn't think there was enough space within social media for both a hemispheric approach to indigenous movements, issues, and critiques of colonialism, as well as I think that many of these discussions need to be had as well on a somewhat intellectual and academic level, because there is a lot of intellectual resources, not just in English but as well as in Spanish, that hasn't been accessed by both academics in the North, but even a lot of indigenous peoples in the South. A lot of it due to educational barriers and the like, as well as a lot of diasporic folks in the U.S. who would benefit a lot from it. And that's one of the and actually we'll be talking about that hopefully. Fausto Reinaga, who's a favorite of mine, and I hope yours as well. So the whole point essentially is to be a bridge between different movements and to show that we have an independent intellectual culture history that we can root ourselves and stem outwards from, rather than becoming in some ways copies of European movements, and get into dialogue with these movements from an indigenous perspective. But in terms of maybe any more merits, I'm just like out of undergrad for a year. I did a lot of research on Andean messianism. I did research on the international indigenous movement since 1977. And lastly, I'm teaching an online class, multiple online classes, one on the history of Andean philosophy, as well as a comparative analysis of the history of land back, where I go through the land movements in Mexico, Guatemala, Chile, and the United States. So I think those are valuable. Those are some of the, I say, fruits of the research I've done that I'm sharing with people.
Yeah, I think the reason why we had you on the podcast today is to discuss a lot of the things that you just kind of brought up, but also to really think about how there is like an independent kind of indigenous tradition in the Western Hemisphere, in what we call Abiala or Pachamama, depending on the context in which you're talking about. There are a variety of different names. Like for us, so for example, the Red Nation comes from the term Oyate Luta, which actually means the indigenous people of the Americas, right? It's not, we didn't adopt kind of this pigmentation logic from the colonizers in terms of like our skin was red. We just believe the earth that we came from and the earth of this hemisphere is red, and so we are indigenous from it. And so that's actually what the Red Nation means, and that's why it's a sacred color for us. It's a color of prayer. It's a color of leftism. It's a color of kind of the politics and the cosmologies that we come from as indigenous people. And so I really appreciate your educational efforts on Instagram and social media, because I think it is, it's a different kind of generational thing. And, obviously you and I are different in age. I'm probably like a decade or so older than you, but
Yeah.
I didn't grow up with social media, and I noticed that a lot of debates happen online, and that's where a lot of, this generation gets their education, which is a good thing, but also it can be, kind of like a harrowing experience, especially when you encounter those who claim to be on the left, who harbor such kind of animosity towards things like, land back or things like that. And so I hope we can talk a little bit about it. But before we get into all that, I really want to just ask you if you could give us a definition, because I've this is something that's really difficult to explain to people in the North because we have been so thoroughly colonized by Western liberal democracy that thinking of an alternative, outside the bounds of what we know as indigenous people is really hard, when we think of alternative ways of governance. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about plurinationalism and what it looks like in practice in places like Bolivia and the struggles that are happening in Guatemala or in Peru, or even in Ecuador, because I think, you look at the struggles in Guatemala, or you look at even in Honduras, and we think of somebody like Berta Cáceres as a water protector and somebody who fought against dams and the protection of the water and the forests. But a lot of people don't really understand that, she was an indigenous revolutionary from the Lenca people who was also fighting for a political and cultural project of plurinationalism, especially in conversation with the Garifuna struggles. But I think that doesn't really compute with a lot of people, in the North. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so if you could very graciously and humbly, maybe explain a little bit about your understanding of plurinationalism.
So I think, just a little note before, I think we shouldn't be so pessimistic in terms of North America. I mean, there is a real conservative culture in both the US and Canada, but there is also a very large conservative liberal, and I mean conservative in the sense of of a strict maintenance rather than the political ideology. But there's a strict conservative conception of liberalism that spans the history of Latin America, or even that might have actually been challenged during the 50s, but in countries like Guatemala were severely crushed. And Guatemala's situation, in similar cases, Peru's situation, are very similar to the ones in the U.S. in that there is a strong right wing that is heavily against a plurinational project. With that being said, those movements are going up, and I think are coming up, and I think we do need that definition for people in the North, because not only are those projects not only do those projects show a future for North America, they're ones that Native peoples in both the U.S. and Canada have actually fought for, which I'll get into in a bit. So a little bit of a cliffhanger for y'all. But a definition of plurinacionalidad or plurinationality, and there is that the state recognizes multiple nations within its own borders, to put it simply. Now, what does that mean? That essentially means that there is a conception of the nation state that is fundamentally lacking. The concept of the nation state comes out of the Treaty of Westphalen during the 1600s in Europe to try to consolidate borders and the period of war of the continuous wars between European states by consolidating one state to one national people. Now, of course, this wasn't perfect, but it's the conception that was brought over to the Americas, and one that consolidated itself following the movements for independence by leaders like Simón Bolívar, by Padre Hidalgo in Mexico, by Washington and Jefferson and the like in the United States, etc. But these conceptions of one nation, i.e. one people to one state, come from a severe lacking in the way how indigenous peoples how we conceive ourselves, essentially, because we're multiple nations. We're not one. Though we've been consolidated into one race because of our condition against colonialism, this doesn't mean that all of our nations are somehow within the same traditions. How that impacted Latin America specifically was the processes of assimilation. In the 1800s, it was the processes of in places like Guatemala, Latinization. In Bolivia and Peru, these were processes of mestizaje, of mixture, but these weren't forms of biological mixture. As mestizaje, for those who don't know, in the North American audience, means the process of cultural and biological mixture, acculturation, so to say, between whites and indigenous peoples. And it's a process that was conceived as the culmination of Spanish colonialism. That the Spanish came by, the majority men, and they in many cases had a quote harmonious union with indigenous women, many of them from the nobility, because the Spanish conquistadors overthrew the nobilities, the chiefdoms, the emperors, etc., across the Americas, and then took over. This was not harmonious, of course, in countries like Mexico. In the case of Tenochtitlan, you had 200,000 people being killed across over multiple weeks, and also the sets of diseases that sprouted across the Americas afterwards and even before. Um, and throughout the 1500s up to the 1900s, there were processes of mestizaje as state policy, that the country is mestizo, and by mestizo, it's essentially peoples who have a biological mixture with indigenous peoples and who have taken on certain indigenous characteristics, but see themselves as part of a European project of forming nation states, of consolidating liberalism within these processes, uh, engaging from a quote Latino or Latin Hispanic perspective towards in both foreign policy and internal policy. And for indigenous peoples, this meant giving up many cultural practices like communalism, worshiping the worship of the earth and harmony with nature, that were seen as impediments to development and to both in the liberal sense and in some cases in the nationalist and even socialist senses in Latin America. And so this process of mestizaje is not a project of just Spanish colonialism. It's not a process of just liberalism. It's a process of European colonization as a whole throughout Latin America. And to bring this all back together, because I love rambling, the point of plurinacionalidad is that while most of these countries, everyone from Mexico down to Argentina, well, Argentina can be questioned just because it has a similar racial self-image as that of the U.S. of a white nation. But every country from Mexico all the way down to Chile conceived of themselves as a mestizo nation. That there's one people, the mestizo, and one state, the various states across Latin America. Plurinacionalidad contests that. Authors like Luis Macas from Ecuador, in the book New World of Indigenous Resistance, and I wish I had the book next to me, but um, he argues that plurinacionalidad contests the nation state's forms of assimilation, which have their roots in Spanish colonialism, and contest them by saying no, the state is composed and must function by recognizing the multiple nationalities within it. Um, that's why in the new constitutions you see in Bolivia and Ecuador, you have multiple nations recognized. I believe it's 14 indigenous nationalities in Ecuador, 36 in Bolivia, and I think those are processes that are very much the same in the United States with boarding schools. You had processes of assimilation. You had processes of trying to impose liberalism. And I don't want to say like, oh, I don't want people to think, oh, the Democrats. And I don't think this is the type of audience that would make that confusion. But in the U.S., this form of liberalism is the same one that exists in Latin America. It's a conservative ideology. It's free markets. It's individualism. It's a very narrow sense of property rights that were imposed not only in Latin America but as well as in the U.S. through boarding schools, which was a communion between state and religious policy. A similar function that happened in Latin America between the Catholic Church and the various states that came about. I think the most famous examples would be Guatemala in 1871. In Mexico, it could be like the Porfirio Diaz regime of the late 1800s, early 1900s. Bolivia following the civil war between the Federalists and the Conservatives, et cetera, et cetera. you have, and in a similar case, there was a similar one with the Civil War, though there was much more of an egalitarian process with trying to free slaves. But then you also had Abraham Lincoln hanging 30, I believe around 36 people.
38.
Or 30, 30 Sioux
38.
warriors.
Yeah, it was 38 Dakota
38
warriors.
Dakota warriors.
Plus 2. Yeah, not too far from actually where we're talking.
So you have but to wrap that up, there is a similar process of assimilation that exists across across the Americas, and I think trying to recognize indigenous peoples in North America as well is what a lot of indigenous peoples are fighting for, and I think there are many lessons that can be learned from Latin America in the U.S. and in Canada.
Yeah, no, that's a really great explanation, and it does really coincide with a lot of thinking, not just kind of previous generations ago, but current thinking around the question of indigenous sovereignty. Because as you said, you have the kind of Westphalian state model, which is like, territory and nation is defined fundamentally on homogeneity. Yeah, I always get it, heterogeneity and homogeneity. Yeah. Homogeneity, which is like basically like uniform kind of race, and also exclusivity in terms of territory. So it's not so much about, it's as much about as it is inclusion as it is about exclusion. Who doesn't belong to the nation? And if you think about the way that indigenous conceptions of sovereignty have existed over time, and obviously we didn't use that terminology sovereignty, it's kind of been introduced, but the way that we've understood it as sort of a continuing project is one that is about to kind of borrow a phrase from the Zapatistas, a world in which many worlds fit, and that our strength was not so much about exclusion and homogeneity as it was about diversity, and understanding that we are, like I guess the way it was explained to me by a Lakota elder one time, her name is Charmaine Whiteface. She said, it's like looking out at prairie grass, where I'm from. That's kind of like the dominant, that's the kind of dominant plant is, prairie grass. It's flat. And you look at prairie grass and you tend to see just one kind of species of grass. But if you look really closely, there's like multiple species of grass that are growing. And she was like, that's what we were like as the Ocheti Shakoni, the Lakota and Dakota people. You look out on the plains and we are the dominant one, but we're not the only one. We shared territory with people. It wasn't utopian. Obviously, we fought and there were, battles, not to any degree in which we experienced in the kind of modern history of colonization, but nonetheless, it was our sense of selves as Ocheti Shakoni, even the notion of our alliances were built on difference and not built on sameness or exclusivity. And so I think it very much lines up with, with what you're saying in terms of how, movements from the South and the southern part of this hemisphere are thinking about alternatives to kind of Western liberal democracy and the imposition of kind of this single national rule. And I guess like a way maybe that might be a different way to frame it in the context of the United States and Canada is thinking about, I've heard this, we used to say this a lot, but multinationalism. Like we have multiple nations within. Plural doesn't really, like the English, it doesn't have the same kind of equivalency in Spanish, I think. But I think that's kind of the same spirit of it. And I did have a question about that because you talked about mestizaje. Yeah. And I think about this in terms of, the kind of, if we look at the roots of resistance in the Western Hemisphere, it's fundamentally defined by indigeneity, by indigenous people, as well as the African ancestors who were brought here as well. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about how, African resistance movements within this hemisphere play into this idea of plurinationality, as well as resistance.
So yeah, just before I get into that, I think it's very interesting to, I want to touch on the idea of multinationality. A little funny tidbit is that multinationality was actually the original term as well as in Spanish. And it was used, you could see it a lot used in the 80s, but a lot of indigenous activists, many of them being anti-capitalist, rejected the term because it was also too close to multinational corporations. Yeah. So no one wants to say, yes, multinationality, you mean for the corporations? No, and no one wants to get their tongue tied. So Plurinationality was the next best term. And I mean, it's like, but I get it. It's like multiculturalism is it's a lot. Multiculturalism, multinationality sounds a lot better on the tongue. In terms of black resistance and black movements, it's actually really interesting because you do see a lot of, you see coalitions forming between both Maroons, freed slaves, escaped slaves during during the 1700s, as well with indigenous movements like the movement, the Tupac Amaru and Tupac Katari rebellions. Tupac Amaru was the Inca descendant indigenous Quechua leader from Peru who led one of the largest uprisings in the Spanish colonies in 1780. Tupac Katari is the Bolivian counterpart, who was from La Paz. Tupac Amaru was from Cusco, Peru. And he was the Bolivian Aymara counterpart, who fought in the same rebellion, though they didn't see eye to eye all the time, for multiple reasons. But during that whole movement, one of the key goals for someone like Tupac Amaru was to actually liberate slaves in Lima, and there were actually two reasons why. One of them was because as someone who was a staunch anti-colonialist, he believed that slavery, especially African slavery, could not be justified under an anti-colonial state, especially one in which indigenous peoples were subjected to very similar, if not even worse, conditions in the Andean sense, because many indigenous peoples were sent to the silver mines of the Cerro Rico, in Potosi, which is where much of the world's silver was mined from, and actually the silver was so expansive that it built much of the European economies and actually funded a lot of trade between European states and China and Japan. So it was an international affair in that sense, like the global capitalist economy. So many indigenous peoples didn't want African slaves to exist in a new Inca state. But Tupac Amaru was also a pragmatist, and I mean, these are the parts where you see how him in his revolutionary struggle has to contend with both the idealism as well as the practicality of it. And he also viewed that trying to liberate slaves in Lima wasn't just a rosy idea, but was one in which one that was strategic, because it would remove much of the labor base in Lima. Lima is the capital of Peru. It's on the coast, which is where many of the slaves stayed, just because it was easy access from the slave ships to the coastal cities, and there was a lot of dependence on black enslaved peoples, whereas towards the center and the west and the east of the country, you had more Andean and Amazonian natives. So he wanted to liberate them. He wanted to liberate black slaves in Lima as a way to cripple the economy of the Spanish capital in Peru, which is something very interesting. You see that type of practicality and idealism trying to meet hands, which don't often happen. Then you also do have Maroon communities appearing across Brazil, across Suriname. I believe also in Guyana, in Jamaica during with the Taino in many early periods. While it's not very documented and it's not very well documented or even spoken about much, there is a lot to learn, and I think it's being recognized a lot in plurinational states, like like the Montubios are recognized, I believe, in Ecuador, and they're a mixed indigenous black and white peoples who do recognize that sovereignty, and their own specific identity. In Guatemala, intellectuals like Demetrio Cocti Cushil with an X, recognize the Garifuna, the Shingas, the Ladinos, and the Mayas all as part of as an indigenous plurinational Mayan state, essentially recognizing the Garifunas as their own separate peoples and not just saying Mayans can control Guatemala, so it's a Mayan state. No, he wanted a plurinational. He wants a plurinational state. So I think it's just important to see how the colonial period, many of the struggles in the colonial period, are being recognized with plurinational states. Sadly, I don't have much. I'm not very well versed in that struggle. Though I think it should be investigated a lot more, especially because African descendant folks are not very well represented in Latin America.
Yeah, and I think, it just kind of gets into my kind of personal interest and political interest in understanding, the roots of both of these resistance movements. Because like here in the States, it's in 2020, it wasn't workers, it wasn't like, trade unions, it wasn't the communist parties or the socialist movements that took to the streets. It was the Black freedom movement that took to the street and really, brought the country to its knees, and has historically. Not to say that those elements of the left aren't part of these movements, but it's because of that historic struggle. In a place like Minneapolis, where this arose, where I'm calling you from, this was also kind of the heart of the birth of the Red Power movement, or a militant aspect of the Red Power movement, the American Indian movement. And back in the day when the American Indian movement was patrolling the streets with against the police repression that was happening in public establishments like the bars, they were going around with the Soul Patrol, which was, it wasn't the Black Panthers, but it definitely was a Black Power movement. And so there's kind of been that historic alliance. And so when the George Floyd uprising happened, it was the Black and the Native communities that really kind of banded together in many ways, and really, like pushed forward the kind of the reforms and the abolitionist movement here in the city. To varying degrees, but of success. But I think that's an important aspect to remember. And also looking back, here in the States, we have the 1619 Project, which kind of like dates the arrival of African slaves from the English or the Anglo-settler colonial project. But if you go back even further in 1523, when Aeon, who was a conquistador, arrived in what is now South Carolina, he brought with him enslaved African people, as well as enslaved Caribbean indigenous people. And they were brought here in like a kind of a plantation, and they banded together with their African relatives, as well as the surrounding indigenous nation, which is I forgot their name. I can't remember their name. It starts with a G, but they banded together and overthrew the Spanish conquistador, and basically sent them back to the Caribbean, and some of them back to Spain. But that was the first successful slave rebellion, as well as the first indigenous movement. And the enslaved African relatives who overthrew the Spanish overlords didn't just disappear. They they became part of the community, the indigenous community. And I think in my mind that like much of what you said about the kind of Mayan state in Guatemala and being recognized, all these kind of different cultures and origin stories, I think there is something to be said about that, and a research project out there that we should definitely recover. I want to turn to a different topic a little bit, because there's a lot to talk about.
Do you mind if I interject real quick?
Yeah, sure.
It's also really interesting to see how when you mentioned George Floyd, like George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, actually the movements to remove a lot of racist Confederate statues influenced movements in Latin America. You actually see peoples in Cauca, in Colombia, who actually were influenced by the movement and took down many conquistador statues in Colombia. And you saw a lot of indigenous peoples across Latin America see themselves recognized when black intellectual, when black folks in the U.S. were recognizing themselves as within this consolidated movement in Black Lives Matter. So and also this isn't a new history, by the way. Like people actually, we're going to talk about Fausto Reinaga, but I think this is a good way to connect the two. And I do want to hear the next question you had planned. But,
yeah, that was actually my next question, is to turn to this. It's something that I've only read about. I read about it in Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, the Indians of the Americas, which is an older kind of book that's out of print. But she does a lot of translation work of looking at like indigenous Marxists in Latin America. And, Fausto Reinaga comes up But I was wondering if you could, there isn't that much out there in terms of, English language materials of these thinkers. But if you could maybe like do like a brief overview of ideas of, indigenous Marxists themselves, but also the idea of an indigenous socialism, because here in North America, it just really hasn't taken root. Like if we compare struggles again, like to the Black freedom movement, there is a strong kind of Black Marxist socialist tradition where, in the American Indian movement, as well as the Red Power movement, there was kind of an overt anti-communism that didn't really allow, for a variety of reasons, which we can get into later, but it just didn't have the same kind of resonance. But then you go south, there were indigenous thinkers, there were indigenous revolutionaries who were engaging with Marxism, some of them rejecting it, or some of them completely and radically reconceiving it for their own conditions of struggle. But if you can you maybe just do like a little brief overview of the history and the origins of that intellectual and revolutionary tradition?
Yeah, that actually is a wonderful question. In Latin America, you have a very interesting history. Marxism does come about during the primarily throughout like the 1910s, 20s, mainly in the 1920s onwards. Before that, it was a lot of anarchist movements. So you had people like Ricardo Flores Magón in Mexico, and you had I always forget this guy's name, but he was the one who influenced Jose Carlos Mariátegui. But as I look up his name, he's the one in Peru. You have anarchist movements, both from a labor perspective as well as from an indigenous. And when I say indigenous, I don't mean like Ward Churchill's conception of indigenism as like a very radical movement, but indigenismo in the Latin American sense of trying to approach indigenous philosophies from an outsider but overall positive perspective. And you do have, so what you have here is that that during the 1920s you do see a burgeoning Latin American Marxist movement that is taken on alongside the indigenista movement. So you had figures like Jose Carlos Mariátegui, and I'm saying it in English so people can look him up, who was influenced by the anarchist Manuel González Prada. He's the one. He can be seen as like Flores Magón's counterpart in Peru, who wrote during the early 1900s, 1910s. So going back to the 1920s, and sorry for jumping around a lot. I want to name drop a lot because I want people to be able to research this. In the 1920s, you had Jose Carlos Mariátegui and Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre, who tried to conceive Marxism from a very interesting perspective. Both of them tried to, in some ways, Peruvianize Marxism. Jose Carlos Mariátegui was a strict communist, though a lot of his ideas were seen as superfluous to a lot of European ones, which I think is a wrong conception of him. So some ideas say of Inca communism. Mariátegui argued that Inca communism, or the communalist system that existed during Incan times, could be the basis for a new 20th century Marxism within the conditions of Peru during the 1920s. He argued that the Ayllu, AYLLU, that was the basis for Quechua communities in Peru, not only showed that communalism existed, that this Incan communism existed, but that it had a direct line from the pre-colonial indigenous system, and that if it could be done before, it could be done again. And it had a double point, and there was the double point of showing, yes, there can be a Peruvian communism that could come about, and this shows that there isn't an inferiority of indigenous peoples, that indigenous peoples could lead a movement. And this actually goes against a lot of Lenin's ideas of the mirror and the mujiks, seeing those as too primitive to base a communism in Russia. And so you do see some conflicts that could come about there between the more traditional Marxist-Leninism that you have and someone like Mariátegui, who himself was a Marxist-Leninist but rejected some of those principles when it came to Peru's specific conditions. Aya de la Torre, he's very interesting because he tried to create a continental idea of Latin America needs to unify under an anti-imperialist broad front perspective. He also argued that imperialism was the first stage of capitalism in Latin America, that it wasn't the other way around. Like, he tried to reverse Lenin, saying imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, where he's like, no, the Spanish invasion was itself the first instance of imperialism, and it's what initiated Latin America, or the Americas, Abya Yala. And Abya Yala, I mean, in like, I want to include North America in that too, to not recreate these types of colonial cultural borders between Latin and Anglo America, since indigenous peoples are colonized by both. But mainly in Latin America, you have the introduction into the world economy was through imperialism. So Aya de la Torre disagreed with both Mariátegui and mainstream Marxist-Leninists, and split off from there. He did take on a more reformist stance in the 40s and 50s onward, so a lot of people were disillusioned. I'm going to focus on the Andes more, but because that's where my focus is. But during the Indigenista movement, you had liberals, you had liberals and reformists, and then you had the assimilationists, and then you had like more Marxists who were much more radical. And in countries like Ecuador, you had Pío Jaramillo Alvarez, who himself was an Ecuadorian indigenous from a liberal perspective, and he argued that the land question should be the focus of indigenous liberation. Mariátegui, and he did this in 1922, whereas Mariátegui comes to this conclusion in 1927 with his book 7 Interpretive Essays on Peruvian Reality. But the difference between the two is that Mariátegui says there needs to be a communal and redistributive process that breaks up the feudal economies in the Andes, because during this time, the economic structure is one known as gamonalismo, where large landlords own large estates that essentially swallowed up whole indigenous villages, and these farmers and indigenous villages were dependent on the landlord to both exist as well as to gain any economic foothold. And unlike Pío Jaramillo in Ecuador, Mariátegui argued you can't just reform this system and give the land back into individual plots. You have to respect the communal aspect in the communal indigenous structure of the Ayllu to actually advance towards a liberatory communism. In Bolivia, you have similar authors like Tristan Maroff, who argued that the Incas as well were the basis for an Inca communism, but didn't argue for the redistribution of land. So these debates that are happening in the 1920s and 30s actually build up to what Fausto Reinaga writes in the 40s, 50s, and onwards. Because many of these indigenistas were not themselves indigenous, though they did approach indigeneity from, like, if you had a model between like mestizo, white, and indigenous, whereas most mestizos were moving towards whiteness, towards hispanidad, towards Hispanicism, which eventually became fascism in the 1920s and 30s. Illegitimately, these became fascist movements that aligned themselves with Germany, Franco's Spain, and Italy. These indigenistas were approaching indigeneity, which was actually a pretty decolonial process for the 1920s. Reinaga is interesting because he's actually an indigenous person. He's born in the campo in the countryside of Oruro. He speaks Quechua and he speaks some Aymara. He's a descendant of one of the revolutionary leaders of the 1780 Tupac revolutions. In this case, it's Tomas Katari, and he gets educated in Marxist movements in Bolivia. And he becomes an admirer of people like José Carlos Mariátegui. During his first period, he was a Marxist. Then he becomes an Indianista, which is a rejection of Marxism for its European foundation, but still maintaining the idea that indigenous peoples must return to an Inca communism in the Andes. And then he moves on to his third and final stage, which is pensamiento amautico, or amautic thought. And this one isn't a rejection, but so to say, it fills the gaps in the intellectual in Indianism, whereas Indianismo was a staunchly political and anti-colonial movement, which he learned from Jose Carlos Mariátegui, from Frantz Fanon. He actually does learn a lot from black radicals in North America. In his famous book La Révolution India, you see him quote Frantz Fanon, Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, and even the radical aspects of Martin Luther King Jr. So he's deeply influenced by black radicalism in the U.S. But we're gonna focus on the first two stages. Fausto Reinaga fights for land reform, returning the land to indigenous peoples within a communalist stance, and then due to the failures there, from where the land reform was a parcelization of land, even though it was still returned. Reinaga, but also his view that Marxism was not capable of understanding Bolivia fully. He moves on to Indianism, to Indianismo, arguing that their indigenous peoples needed to complete and go beyond the project of indigenismo. That indigenismo was too assimilatory because it was dependent on on liberalism, on socialism, and needed to become and even on fascism with the Hispanistas. So there needed to be a rejection of all three and move on to an indigenous ideology that was founded on Inca spirituality and religion, the worship of the earth and harmony with nature, as well as an Inca communism that itself was tailored to the 20th century. All that to say that Fausto Reinaga in some ways is the culmination and in some ways the first step into an authentically indigenous philosophy in Bolivia and in Latin America, because it tries to de-link itself from both the Marxist movements that he saw were insufficient, from the indigenistas who he saw as in some ways assimilatory and also in some ways weak in terms of resolving many of the problems in Latin America, and he speaks from an indigenous perspective, so he's able to critique Western philosophy from a distinctly Bolivian perspective. But he's not a Luddite. He interacts and engages with intellectuals across the Americas, and most notably those in North America, in the Black United States.
I mean, there's a lot to go on there, and I just want to
I'm pretty long-winded.
No, it's great. I really appreciate the explanation, because it's a succinct, kind of overview of a longer tradition. There's so many questions that I have. I mean, as somebody who identifies as a Marxist, I don't think there is, in my understanding, as I've come to it, I didn't come through it through academia. I came to it through movement stuff, because it was like, oh, you read a text by Marx, and it was like, wow, how come I've never engaged this, in certain ways? But in my mind, it doesn't, it's actually taught me more about understanding what imperialism is and what capitalism is. And one thing that I always, that I've kind of arrived at is also like how indigenous people become sort of consumed in this process and made as indigenous people. We weren't always indigenous people. Like, that's something that we have to point out. Like, I'm Lakota. Like, the word indigenous was never uttered until maybe the 18th century, as a way to define. And so these concepts are new, but indigeneity is a thoroughly modern, conception. It's both one in which has kind of like it's a dual meaning. One in which it means a people essentially without a place, because we're supposed to be stateless according to the UN definitions. We're supposed to be stateless, etc. But then on the other hand, as you're pointing out, there's these kind of philosophies and political and cultural traditions that are definitely tied to place and land. Yeah. So in one hand, it has this kind of negative connotation. I would just call it like perpetual statelessness, and the lack of I guess being colonized. And then on the other hand, there's this kind of generative aspect of it. And I think, as somebody who's trying to confront, not just as an individual, but a movement trying to confront capitalism and colonialism, and understanding colonialism is fun to, capitalism is the motor in which they're not just trying to, kill us as indigenous people because they hate our culture. It's because we have resources and land. and we're, in the settler colonial context of the U.S. and Canada, it wasn't so much about our labor as it was just that we were an impediment and we had to be exterminated. Where in other contexts, that's not the same thing. And so our understanding, I guess, of capitalism and how we confront colonialism, is different. And the reason why, I really like your work and like the explanation that you give is because I look at it from both an indigenous perspective as well as a Marxist perspective. And on one hand, I would say indigeneity, as you pointed out, in indigenismo, is not fundamentally revolutionary or anti-capitalist necessarily. It can be anti-colonial for the most part. And then Marxism isn't fundamentally indigenous either, And so you're kind of confronted with this reality, but I would say that Marxism is more at the service of indigenous people than indigenous people at the service of Marxism. And the reason why I say that is because thinking, and from what I've learned in my study and in my practice in organizing, is to understand that, like, if we look at the history of indigenous people and the way you explained it with the IU system, and Meriategui was looking at, and you look at even the kind of concrete practices of attempts at creating anti-capitalist formations and movements within, places like Bolivia, where you have this kind of communalist mentality that still exists, but it kind of runs up against, because, it's fundamentally against like representation, right? It's about consensus, which is a much different process in democracy, a democratic process, than like liberal representation. But what's happened is that our kind of economic mode of non-exploitation that didn't involve, the kind of there is exploitation, but it didn't involve kind of the commodification of nature and a capitalist mode of production. And so everything culturally, and this is what I got from reading Meriategui, everything culturally that we've developed, our values, our political systems, our ways of governance, the way we understand ourselves in relation to the material, the natural world, is fundamentally non-capitalist, because that was our mode of production. That's how we physically reproduced ourselves on the land upon which we lived. Colonization comes in and knocks out that mode of production and introduces one of extraction, of exploitation, of commodification, but it can't entirely destroy the kind of superstructure of our knowledge systems, our cultural values of reciprocity, of relationality. And then like what happens in the 20th century, when there are these kind of burgeoning anti-colonial movements, decolonization movements throughout the world, the Western Hemisphere, we're sitting here thinking, and like in a place like I'm just going to use the U.S. because this is where I'm from and I understand it the best. Yeah. A place like the U.S. isn't looking for, it's not looking at the kind of foundations, or the foundations of socialism as they existed, for centuries prior to colonization. It's literally just trying to create a new America, or a new kind of settler project that may be anti-capitalist, but is completely still based on the elimination of native people. Yeah. Whereas, why would you try to create something new, when there's already a strong foundation of something that exists here today? They couldn't entirely erase our ceremonies, our language, our worldviews and value systems. Even though we're living in a capitalist world, there's a reason why this is also in the 21st century, the era of the water protector. And the water protector isn't just like an indigenous framework. Anyone can be a water protector, but it's about those values would not have come to the fore or to the mainstream had it not been for indigenous movements. And so my argument is kind of both, it's both against this kind of trend to like reject everything from Marx, but then it's also this other trend to just kind of embrace this new nation idea of like of settler colonialism, or what some people are calling like social patriotism, or whatever that is.
I've dealt with them. I can tell you that.
But it's to say, like, it's really to look at what you're pointing to, and to show how, there in many ways, I would argue that a lot of these thinkers who are coming from the South have are far more advanced in their thinking and their research on these issues. And I don't know if you have anything to say in response to that, but it's just listening to you talk, it was like there's so many kind of questions that I have that are arising from that. But that's like my primary, that's my primary takeaway, is that it's like I understand the kind of drift away from Marxism as kind of like a European tradition, or trying to, I guess what happens sometimes is that people take a model from somewhere else and try to impose it onto a place where it doesn't really make sense, or where there's a kind of like it didn't arise organically. It wasn't an act of heroic creation, to quote Mariátegui, in the sense that it wasn't creating, an indigenous socialism, both with a uppercase I, but also with a lowercase I, that arises from the specific material conditions of this land,
Yeah. I want to read a quote, because I think this is from Fausto Reinaga, and this is not from his famous book La Revolución India, or the Indian Revolution, which was published in 1969, far after he had abandoned Marxism, his first stage of Marxism, but from his other famous book, Tierra y Libertad, or Land and Freedom, which was published in 1953, and it was a sociological study of the question of land. And this is following the national revolution in Bolivia in 1952, which saw the introduction of an anti-imperialist nationalist coalition from both somewhat right-wing nationalists, but also you have Marxist movements, both Marxist-Leninists, you have Trotskyists, you have Bolivian left nationalists and anti-imperialists. It's a really weird hodgepodge. But Reinaga's quote in that book, and it's a distinctly Marxist analysis of the land question and of Bolivian history, starts out with something very unique. It says, when the autochthonous Indian wisdom says man is child of the earth, it speaks a great truth. Evidently, humans, since they are born from her generous innards, are fed in this passage through the world with her fruits, animals, vegetables, minerals, and after breathing their last breath of life, they return to her bosom. Pachamama, or the Andean earth goddess, is the mother of man. That's a distinctly one could say that's a distinctly spiritualist, metaphysical analysis that's beyond Marxism. How dare you be indigenous? Like those but he does this as a way to explain that there's a certain type of spiritually embedded materialism that he starts out from. That the relationality that one has to nature is not one of nature gains meaning through the labor that one puts into the world, which is the classical Marxist formula that labor gives meaning to land and turns it into commodities and capital. Rather, Reinaga, starting from his Andean Marxist perspective, is saying the earth itself is already alive, and without it, one cannot be human itself. So it's not that humans create meaning to the earth, it's that the earth creates meaning, it creates the human first, and then the human creates a dialectical relationship with the human in which one is feeding and being fed. One is feeding oneself and being fed from Pachamama and seeing a familial relationship with it. Without one, the other cannot exist. This is the idea of Yanantin in Quechua, or Chachawarmi in Aymara, or this can be considered complementary duality. That this goes against the Hegelian dialectic of one must overcome these. You have the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis. You have to have the thesis and the antithesis. One must overcome the other and create a synthesis. It's one of consumption. It's one of literally overcoming the other. Rather, in the Andean perspective, it's one of harmony in that dialectic, that one must not overcome the other, but one must learn to live with the other and then create a mutually beneficial, symbiotic synthesis out of it. To use Marxist terminology, and that's Yanantin. That's complementary duality in the Andean, pre-colonial Andean sense. And Reinaga is starting his Marxism off from that perspective, that the earth, and then he goes on to say, labor, the land goes to those who work it. But that only comes after this quote. meaning that if you can consider, if your perspective towards nature is one that's already separated from it as a independent living being from which humans from which we can gain meaning and not just impart it, then you're already engaging within a insufficient colonial process, because this is because that embedded spirituality, the view that nature is both mother and family, that it both holds rationality and teaches and gives meaning to humans, is what created the indigenous communalism in the first place. Mm-hmm. That you couldn't separate spirituality and materialism, and to do so already goes against the ways indigenous peoples view the land in the first place. And why does this go into land reform? Because, well, I think land reform is important because, one, it overcame, it actually was what a lot of indigenous peoples in North America wanted. It's land back. Literally millions of hectares, tens of millions of acres were returned during the land reform periods in Latin America. It's land back completed, actually. And a lot of native peoples in North America don't know that land back was completed in any case. In this case, it was Bolivia in 1954, or 1953 or 54. In Peru, it was 1969. In Ecuador, it was it was half reformed in 1964, I believe. Then you had other countries that were attempted, like 1968 Chile, which was cut down by Pinochet, or like 1910 Mexico, 1915, and then 1936 with Lázaro Cárdenas, which was actually the only other major successful land reform for indigenous peoples other than Bolivia, since Cuba has a very minimal indigenous population. The point I'm trying to say is that Reinaga, when he makes this thesis, and he's part of the Congress in Bolivia and sees the land reform legislation that's passed by the nationalist government, by the MNR government, it's a process of parcelization. Individuals and family and small families are the only ones who are allotted land. It's not the communal, collectivized mode of production that indigenous peoples are used to in the Ayllu. So in some ways, this was a form of a nationalist liberalism, that the nation was finally taking back control from the semi-feudal oligarchy, but was trying to make respectable workers in the free market or within the market, so that indigenous peoples can be, quote, productive. That the Ayllu was insufficient for the 20th century. He also viewed that this type of perspective also went against how indigenous peoples conducted religious and spiritual practices, that it was the communal land that put people in relationship with the earth. So this is and he viewed that a lot of Marxists viewed a lot of the indigenous Andean spirituality as metaphysical. He also saw that the question of nationalities was rejected by a lot of Marxists as well. That both Indian nationalist government and the Communist Party in Bolivia, indigenous peoples following the land reform were no longer indigenous. They were campesinos. They were peasants. Mm-hmm. It's a similar process as the one that Thomas Jefferson envisioned for America, that all the peoples who had land would become yeoman farmers. And the process of the boarding schools wanted a similar process as well, that indigenous peoples would give up their spirituality in North America and would become yeoman farmers and reject their collectivized ways of living. In Bolivia, this process is happening in the 1950s as well. So Reinaga views that both the rejection of indigenous peoples as their own nation, as their own separate nations, as their own separate people distinct from the mestizos and white folks, as well as the rejection of indigenous spirituality, showed deficiencies in both the nationalist model in Bolivia, the anti-imperialist nationalist model, as well as the Marxist model that had contained a lot of that had been unwilling to remove many of the chauvinistic practices, many of which would have been much more acceptable if they came from a perspective like Mariátegui, but they had not. They had already rejected Mariáteguismo as superfluous, so falling in line with the Comintern at the time, with the Soviet Union. So there's this internal battle with Reinaga, where he has to see how can indigenous peoples maintain both the land, which was actually conquered by indigenous peoples, but was betrayed by the government with personal and individual allotment, but also do so in a way where indigenous peoples can maintain their own difference. And this is the kicker. It's not just about land back. It's about Indian power, according to Fausto Reinaga. He conceived Poder Indio, which he actually got from Black Power. And it's interesting. Red Power and Black Power Red Power and Poder Indio have the same basis in Black Power in the U.S. Isn't that something to learn? But Poder Indio says it's not enough to have indigenous. It's not enough to have the land back, because the governments that have the that type of humanitarianism behind it will betray it for both the expediency as well as the interest of the nation state that both assimilates and has rejected indigenous peoples in the past. Meaning that if indigenous peoples are to truly gain a decolonial future, indigenous peoples must hold political power over that land as much as economic power. And one without the other means that indigenous peoples will both lose rights to the land or will not have the projects they want completed, leading to a lot of the economic failures and insufficiencies from 1964 all the way up to Evo Morales' election. That's a 50-year period or 40-year period in which neoliberalism was on the rise.
Yeah, that's kind of leads into my next question. But before we get to that, I want to just take a little bit of a step back, because we are talking about Indian power. So just to kind of clarify too, Red Power came from an indigenous activist with the National Indian Youth Council. His name was Clyde Warrior. He actually knew, he listened to a speech by Kwame Ture, who first used Black Power. And there's they were saying, like, I guess, like, according to, the historians, Clyde Warrior was using it like almost kind of simultaneously as Kwame Ture was using it, or formerly known as Stokely Carmichael. Yeah. And it wasn't like this antagonistic thing that people say today, like where it's like, oh, the Black movement and the Native movement, because Kwame Ture was showing up to Native events, and so too were like Native people showing up to Black Power events. And so the way it's explained to me is that it wasn't necessarily like a branch of Black Power, but it rose simultaneously in solidarity with Black Power. And it's really cool to see that somebody like Fausto Reinaga was using this Indian power, Indian poder, in the context of Bolivia. It just shows like how these ideas travel, but also how they speak to the material conditions across borders. Of course. And
one quick thing is that actually I just learned this a month ago, but Fausto Reinaga actually had his book La Revolución India sent to New York in 1970. There's a letter that was published by his niece Hilda Reinaga, who is the head of his estate and who does a lot of the republishing work for his books. And the book actually was sent to, quote, Black Panthers who were working with Kwame Ture in 1970, so to show that he had been influenced by Kwame Ture, but also to show that he was in solidarity with the Black Panthers or with the Black movement in the U.S. at that time. So you see already these international connections happening in real time, and many of the Black Panthers the Black activists that had met with I think one of Reinaga's sons in Mexico had said, this is very similar to the work that we're doing. Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you came to this on your own from an indigenous perspective. And I think if we come to this, I think we should come to this from a perspective that's not often said, George Manuel's The Fourth World, mm-hmm. a fourth world perspective of indigenous movements, showing that indigenous peoples after the anti-colonial movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which in some ways betrayed indigenous peoples, the third or like left indigenous peoples kind of on the back burner. The fourth world allows for indigenous peoples to view ourselves within these, and even and Black folks as well, Black folks in across the Americas, across Aviala, to see ourselves in this continual dialectical conversation. Mind you, I'm no Marxist, but I think it's important to have those conversations between Marxists, between like Marxists of all stripes, between Black activists and Indigenous activists, because it's literally a part of Indigenous history ever since the 70s and even before. So for the folks out there who think, oh, no coalition needs to be built, you're absolute fools. Like, this is literally what brought about a lot of successes and actually influenced movements like in Bolivia. I mean, Bolivia, Evo Morales would not be Evo Morales if he had not read Fausto Reinaga in the 90s. And he says that too. It's what brought me to be an Indian. Black and Indigenous activism and intellectualism together brought Evo Morales into consciousness. So I think that shows the importance of that type of coalition building.
Yeah, and I want to return to that in a bit, but I want to go back in time a little bit, because you and I are kind of both students of Indigenous internationalism, and the Red Power movement was very much as we've already kind of explained a little bit.
Yeah,
Red Power or Indian Power was an internationalist movement, and it had that impulse. And you have studied the 1977 Geneva Convention, as well as kind of, I think, the lesser known in the States Continental Gathering in Quito, Ecuador in 1990, but equally as important. And I'll give a little bit of context to the 1977 Geneva conference, and then you can elaborate. But from my research and from my studies, this arose in the post kind of Wounded Knee period, when many of the leadership of the American Indian movement had been tied up in the courts. I think it's also important to point out as well that, like, people think of the kind of militants of the American Indian movement as well as the Red Power movement as kind of the progenitors of a lot of the ideas, which is, partially true, but they were always in conversation with elders. And I think one of the kind of mainstays of our political and intellectual and spiritual traditions at that time that they were continually returning to and tapping into for guidance was, the treaty councils. Because they were the ones, who understood beyond just kind of the relationships of the United States with indigenous nations, understood the kind of long political traditions. And that's why you have, like, not just for Lakota people, but also like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy has a very strong internationalist tradition going back to like Desgaje, and even to somebody like Eli Parker, who, served as an informant or a friend and ally to, what the heck is that guy's name?
Ulysses S. Grant.
He wrote Ancient Society. What's his name?
Oh man, he was an anthropologist, right?
Yeah, I can't even remember his name, but it was that book served that book served Ancient Society, which was Eli Parker, who also Henry Louis Morgan. That's who it is.
Yeah, there we go. People want to read that book.
Yeah, so Eli S. Parker was the person who drafted the terms of surrender for the Confederacy, and he was also the secretary for Ulysses S. Grant during the Civil War. But he was also somebody who had a very vast esoteric. He was also a chief. He was considered a head person of his own tribe, the Seneca Nation, which is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And so, and then you'd have somebody like Desgaje, who's from Six Nations in north of the border here in so-called Canada. But you have this like really amazing like political tradition just in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, going back to their role in the U.S. Civil War, as well as like understanding how, later, Friedrich Engels and Marx understood, had added that famous asterisk, I think, in the Communist Manifesto, as like all hitherto society is a history of class struggle. And then they made an asterisk and they're like, actually, not all societies were that way. Maybe Europeans. But that was because of Eli S. Parker's influence, an indigenous person's influence on, Marxist thought. And I think he needs to be given more credit, but that's a whole nother story. Going back to the 1977 Geneva Convention, you have these political traditions, arising, I would say, between the three strongest nations in North America at that time in the Red Power movement would have been the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabe Nation, as well as the Lakota, Dakota nations. And they really brought together this kind of international, in the context of North America, they brought together this kind of international frame because they understood that militant armed resistance against the United States government was unsustainable, nor was it the overall strategy of the Red Power movement. I think it's been framed that way. But the elders actually got together and said, we need to take this, this movement to the international arena, and really pushed the American Indian movement to kind of create a new vehicle of struggle, which was the International Indian Treaty Council, which became a much kind of bigger challenge of getting in the United Nations than just showing up. And so the 1977 Geneva Convention was a product of not only the struggle of the Red Power and American Indian movements, but also it brought together kind of different actors, especially from the global South, who are facing similar conditions, and understood that there were, indigenous peoples up until that point had no formal recognition nor representation at the United Nations. And it's also important to point out that prior to this 1977 conference, it was the alliance, the strategic alliance with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, as well as the Palestinian Liberation Organization at the time, that helped redraft and create the category of indigenous people. It was indigenous people, and then it became indigenous peoples. But it was the decade for the UN decade against racism and apartheid, which also said that Zionism was a form of racism, which was of course reversed in the Oslo Accords in 1993. But I think it's important to understand that context, it wasn't just the kind of hemispheric approach of indigenous peoples in the Americas, but they were like strategically, using but in alliance with the South African anti-apartheid struggle, as well as the PLO, because Palestinians have navigated and mastered the UN human rights frameworks. But it was those kind of critical conversations that really gave rise to what we now know as an international indigenous movement. And I don't know if you want to take it over from there and kind of give a different perspective, or fill in the blanks, so to speak, of what was happening in the South at that time.
Yeah, so this is all in the post land reform period. So in Latin America during you see in the 1950s and 60s the rise of land reform movements. The only countries that had land reforms before was Mexico. Mexico had its land reform after the Mexican Revolution and during the 30s, which was actually successful. But mind you, it didn't stop indigenous movements. The question of land was only one aspect, a very important one, but only one aspect. And it was true for Latin America, for the rest of Latin America. In Bolivia, the land reform happened in 1953. In Peru, 1969, under General Juan Velasco Alvarado. If you can believe it, a leftist general who did a coup. Those words don't seem to compute for a lot of people. It's very interesting. In Chile, 1968. In Guatemala, you had 1954 or 1952, but that was crushed after the coup against Jacobo Arbenz. And in the 1970s and 80s, you had some in Central America. But by the time of 1977, the land reform had been consolidated had been consolidated across Latin America. But many indigenous movements and many indigenous peoples didn't see the conditions of indigenous peoples improving. There was still there was still both racism in society as well as state-sponsored assimilation projects. Indigenous peoples were being hunted down, especially in countries like Guatemala. In Bolivia, indigenous peoples were starting to form. This is the point where Fausto Reinaga and his Indianismo and the Catarismo, or the Catarism with a K, not a Q, the Catarism in Bolivia, which was in some ways a sister movement to Indianismo, had already consolidated. In Chile, this was during Pinochet. In Argentina, I think this was the start of the Dirty Wars. In Peru, this was still at the time of 2 years after Juan Velasco's regime, but under a more reformist general who still betrayed the movement. In Ecuador, this was during, I think, maybe a general as well. In Guatemala, this was right before the Civil War, and in Mexico, this was after the time of the land reform, but there were still a lot of PRI presidents who were leaving indigenous peoples on the back burner. So all of these countries actually attended, and then you had other countries like Suriname, and and Brazil actually going, two very different but like very interesting histories there. All of these countries, except for Brazil, going to the 1977 Geneva Conference, and it was organized by indigenous activists, especially some people like Jimmy Durham, who was a Cherokee poet and activist living in Geneva, according to and he actually engaged with the IITC and the AIM in the 1970s after he saw the rise in Red Power. Um, and he was one of the ones who actually was the links between between the organizers in the NGO organizers in Geneva, Switzerland, and the indigenous movement in the United States. Many other indigenous activists, like Nilo Cayuqueo from Argentina, a Mapuche from Argentina, was living in California, I believe, at the time, or had eventually moved, and he was also one of the other links with Latin America. So you had this strange coalition of international indigenous movements engaging with different organizations and different prominent leaders who all converged in Geneva. And the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, were the ones who mainly led it from the North American side. But in the book, why don't I have it next to me?
So the
In the
basic
book,
call to consciousness.
yeah,
I think I
Basic
actually
Call
have
to
it next to
Consciousness.
me.
If you can put it up, I think everyone should buy it. By the way, it is
Yeah.
a fantastic book. Basic Call to Consciousness. You who is it? Jose Barreiro writes the story of how the coalition between how many indigenous people saw a real unity happening there. From what was it? And then eventually the Haudenosaunee wrote the pamphlet Basic Call to Consciousness, which is included there. And if you're interested in indigenous philosophy, that's your book. From there, many of those indigenous activists, seeing the international condition, actually recognized indigenous peoples had a common cause in going to 1990. And it wasn't ones just centered on the land. It was one centered on indigenous recognition of self determination, indigenous ability for for economic self sufficiency, for mediators between nation states and indigenous peoples on the international level, because all of these nation states, everyone from Canada all the way to Argentina, engaged in some form of settler colonialism. Literally settler colonialism, the attempt to remove people off the land and extinguish indigenous identity. By 1990, there was another common cause, which was the 500-year anniversary with 500-year arrival of Columbus, and activists in Ecuador, many of them Quechua, Saraes, Ashuar, Shuar, etc., had actually just completed one of the largest indigenous uprisings, the Inti Raymi uprising of 1990. 2 weeks later, they held the Eagle and Condor gathering. This is actually one of the first places you hear the term Eagle and Condor as a spiritual prophecy for indigenous unity.
That's the unification of North, which is the eagle, and then
Yes.
South, which is the condor.
Yes, and in one of the pamphlets, actually, it does say the myth of the eagle and condor from the perspective of Quechua peoples. Whether or not it was made for that conference, elders had created the prophecy, or it was something from time immemorial or from 500 years before, is still a question and debated concept. But by 1990, indigenous peoples had already formed international organizations, more regional ones, like in South America, between Bolivia and Peru, and then other ones like those in North America. But in 1990, after this uprising, the CONAI, the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities, the CONAIE, which is the largest indigenous organization in Ecuador, after they had made this meeting, many of these indigenous activists came by to both bring solidarity, but to also consolidate the international indigenous movement, to show that there is a unity in both criticism and in goals between between Anglo North America and Latin America. And it's from here that a lot of further indigenous movements and international indigenous conferences come out. But in terms of the consequences of it's more of the fact that it consolidated a lot of some of the mythologies and prophecies that we have today, as well as the concept of a unified international indigenous movement. The conference itself didn't accomplish much, since it was also heavily surveilled by the Ecuadorian government, and but in many cases, concepts such as recognizing many indigenous nations within the nation state was also heavily discussed. Ecuadorians had argued for a plural society, una sociedad pluralística, or pluralista. So, and those ideas also influenced activists across the Americas, across Abya Yala. So you do have some of the seeds there being planted for plurinacionalidad as well, which does have its tie in 1977, and then even before that to Descaje in the 1920s. So I think that long indigenous that international indigenous history is a century old. So it's a shame that not enough people know about it.
Yeah, and just to kind of add like a little footnote to you talked about Jimmy Durham. It's kind of like come to the attention like now. I mean, it was kind of discussed at the time that there is, like his identity with the Cherokee Nation has been questioned by Cherokee people themselves.
Oh no, wannabe.
Yeah. I mean, that's just the reality of it. Like that was also the situation at the time where it was like people with, stories or whatever were like oh yeah, an Indian grandmother, blah, 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 blah. And so, but I think it's worth actually being honest about it in the present and saying this is, but also recognizing that this, you don't have to be an indigenous person to participate in these kinds of things or to have the kind of impact, but also you shouldn't lie about who you are if you don't know.
I think someone like Jim Curl, I believe that's his name, Jim Curl, he was actually a delegate for the mayor of the city of Berkeley at the CONAI conference. And he's one of the ones who organized the 1992 Eagle and Condor powwow in the city of Berkeley. Yeah. So, and he never claimed to be a Cherokee like the man Jimmy did, but
Ward Churchill did too.
Yeah, or Ward Churchill, or like Andrea. What was it?
Andrea Smith.
There's a laundry list of them, and it's a shame. None of them had to be indigenous to make accomplishments, and someone like Jim Crow actually was heavily influential in powwow culture, despite not being indigenous, because his powwow in Berkeley not only commemorated the 500-year anti-celebration of Columbus Day and the beginnings of Indigenous Peoples Day, but it also included indigenous peoples from Latin America, which was one of the first times in which indigenous peoples from Peru, Chile, Argentina, etc., had been included in powwows. So I'm not sure if Jack D. Forbes ever got involved with bringing Chicanos in, but this was the second wave of including folks from Latin America. It was not just Mexicans and Chicanos being included; it was the rest of Latin America that was being included in indigenous culture in the U.S. in the 1990s, and it was a direct influence from the CONAI conference. So a lot of the culture we have there is thanks to that meeting in 1990 in Ecuador.
Yeah, and also Jack D. Forbes is claims
Don't tell me he's also fake. No, I can't handle that.
Oh man, it's just the tragedy of colonialism and this identity stuff. I mean, he's been called out as well, and it's just like you said, it's tragic because it's you grow up reading this stuff and there's already such a scarcity of written text, but also there isn't a scarcity of written text. I mean, that's part of our job as scholars and, people who are committed to this intellectual tradition. We can't lie, we shouldn't, and we also shouldn't harbor, people who are misrepresenting themselves. It doesn't do anybody any good. Yeah. But I think just going back and just real quickly to think about where this tradition, kind of precedes people like Jack Forbes and, these other people that we've talked about. If you think about somebody like Archie Finney, Nimapu, which is also known as Nez Perce, but he was, he had this idea. He was talking about settlers. He was talking about colonialism at a time in the 1930s. He was an anthropologist who actually trained under Franz Boas, and he actually helped found in 1944 the National Congress of American Indians, believing that there should be some kind of like confederation, of indigenous people. But he was also thinking about looking at like Mexico and. He worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the time, but he also, it's kind of a fascinating history. I think, I suspect that he was a Marxist, or at least influenced by Marxist ideas, because he studied in the Soviet Union in the 1930s and saw at the time, they're having like bicultural, bilingual education programs with a lot of the indigenous people in Siberia. And so he was trying to think about what that would mean for like Indian policy, but also indigenous autonomy in the United States in terms of, because he was a fluent language speaker. He was the first person to write an orthography of the Nimapu language. But of course, he had like an FBI file. They thought he was a communist. Yeah. May have been, I don't know. But it's like fascinating. He died like rather abruptly, and of a disease. But his he's not really kind of like held up, I think, because of his association with the Soviet Union as somebody who we should go back and find. And I'd be more than happy to share some of his writings with you, because he's like way beyond his time in how he's thinking about things. And so it's also, on one hand, it's like a little upsetting to always hear like, okay, this person might not be indigenous, but also, and there might be like a sense of like, oh, there's scarcity out there. But then if we look closer at our own traditions, we will find, intellectuals and thinkers who are far beyond their times, but maybe didn't get the kind of consideration that they should have gotten, and that's partly why I, invited you on the show, because I really like your work on, on social media and everything. And, having read Reinaga a little bit, through various translated, various quotes in translation, it's something that I'm interested in. But, I want to turn a little bit back to this conversation we were having earlier about Evo Morales and his consciousness. And, I think in the, Evo hasn't really had a lot of his work, translated into English. And we're working on a project right now. Wonderful. To do some of that. Hopefully sometime soon we'll get some information out there. But, somebody like Garcia Linera, his vice president, is always kind of thought of, he's, a white guy, Bolivian white guy, is always kind of thought of as like the intellectual muscle of like MAS, movement towards socialism, or the project of, that they have underway down there. And Evo isn't really thought of as kind of an intellectual person, but I've seen him, I met him, and I've listened to him talk, and he is, he's definitely a union organizer for sure. But he is a very smart person, and his thought, I think, is incredibly important. And I was wondering if you could maybe put him into context in this conversation that we're having about indigenous socialism, plurinationalism, the rise of the movement towards socialism, and the kind of Bolivian experiment that is currently underway.
Yeah. Before I get into that, I do want to like give out some names for people who are like, oh, there's not much like Andean Marxism that existed. In Ecuador, you have like Luis Monsalve Pozo, who was a Marxist in Ecuador at the time during the 40s and 50s, and he was associated with Pío Jaramillo and like the Indigenista movement at the time. You have the Federación Ecuatoriana de Indios, the Federation of Ecuadorian Indians, the FEI, which was prominent during the 50s and 60s, which had actually indigenous Marxist women. One of the few movements where they were prominent, like Tránsito Amaguaña, and I can't believe I'm forgetting her other name. She's if you look it up though, Tránsito Amaguaña, she's usually paired with another Quechua woman who actually is quite intellectual, though she never wrote any independent books. I think they're mainly interviews. But they speak from a Quechua perspective in terms of the fight for land. In Peru, you have similar movements like the Confederación Campesina del Perú, or the the Peasant Confederation of Peru, the CCP, not the Chinese Communist Party, but like the the other CCP, the more famous one, the one from Peru. But they were the major labor organizers, and they were successors.
Are you talking about the Shining Path?
No, the Shining Path. Well, the Shining Path are very controversial, and I personally don't like them. Of the Shining Path, there were ideas where maybe the CCP, the Confederation, or the Peasant Confederation Peru was working with the Shining Path.
Yeah,
but it's tenuous at best. But yeah, many of those leaders were working since the 20s and 30s, and leaders that were a part of it, like Hugo Blanco, who was he's actually a mestizo farmer in Cusco who actually learned Quechua and deals with and works with indigenous peoples. In some ways, he was indigenized into the community and welcomed in I forget which community in Cusco, but he's a fluent Quechua speaker. And there's an interesting thing in which many mestizos re-indigenize, and I think that should be important because many mestizos, mixed peoples, are actually indigenous. There's just been a rejection of that indigeneity and the move towards hispanidad, and not the move towards indigeneity. But that's a conversation for another day. But you have Hugo Blanco, you have the MIR, the Movimiento Izquierdista Revolucionario during the 60s. You have Juan Velasco Alvarado, who worked with many Marxist-Leninists for the land reform. Then you have, and you can even go towards you can even move towards the 21st century with Vladimir Cerrón, who is the intellectual leader of Peru Libre, the party that's in the presidency right now. If you read his pamphlet for the presidential policy, for the presidency, for the government platform, it's very interesting because it does gain it both shows a Marxist-Leninist influence in him that does tie back to Mariátegui, a plurinational influence, and an economic one, which I'm tying it all here, to Bolivia. Like, because he was influenced by the economic and cultural and political policies in Bolivia, especially those of Evo Morales, Luis Arce, who's now the president, and others. And in Bolivia you have people like Jesus Lara, who's also a Marxist, who actually debated, who was a contemporary of Fausto Reinaga. So, and Tristan Marov, who was the one from the 20s. So and then you have, I forget, Jose Quiroga de Santa Cruz, who was a socialist leader, who was killed during coup, in a right-wing coup. Now, a lot of these people are actually recognized by Evo in his inaugural speech when he was inaugurated in 2006. Like Quiroga de Santa Cruz, who was that major socialist leader. But you also had other intellectuals like David Choquehuanca or Eusebio Gironda. I'm not sure. Eusebio Gironda. It should be backwards, but you have a lot of these intellectuals that are supporting the MAS and are even part of the MAS government. David Choquehuanca, he's a Quechua who speaks Aymara, who was born in La Paz, so it's very interesting that people confuse it for Aymara. But he writes a lot about Buen Vivir, a lot about the intellectual movement which is similar to Fausto Reinaga in that you need to fuse the Andean spirituality with an anti-capitalist, collectivist relationship between humanity, and then reciprocity between humanity and nature, Yanantin. You have those people working on the more indigenist, Indianist side of Evo Morales, and on the other side you have the more economicist wing of the party, which is like Luis Arce and Garcia Linera, who were both trained economists and sociologists. They were part of the Marxist movements, whereas Choquehuanca was part of the indigenous labor union movement. So you have these two wings that are converging with Evo Morales. Evo Morales himself coming from the labor movement, the cocaleros, the cocoa farmers in Cochabamba. But he's also influenced by both of these traditions. He's deeply influenced by the anti-imperialist and Marxist traditions, especially like Che Guevara. But on the other side, he reads people like Fausto Reinaga during the 80s and 90s. He's even tweeted about Fausto Reinaga. There's like one tweet about him, but he shows like he knows who Reinaga is. His government also republished Reinaga's works, especially the complete works, like Las Obras Completas. So it was state-sponsored republication of his texts, showing his appreciation for that intellectual history. And I think someone like Evo Morales, in some ways, unified a lot of the disparate the disparate leftist and decolonial movements that found a common ground with someone like Evo Morales, who was who came from multiple backgrounds. But I think the most important part about Evo, I think, is that his presidency created an intellectual culture that is not seen in other countries like Peru or Ecuador, or even across Latin America. Because whereas in Ecuador you have the division between the Conai, the indigenous, and then the Marxists, the Correístas. In Peru you don't have that strong indigenous culture of like, yes, indigenous intellectuals are popping up left and right. You have people like Ciro Galvez, yeah, but not much after that. In Bolivia, in some ways, Evo Morales' presidency consolidated in a uniquely indigenous Bolivian intellectualism that is, in some ways, that is still burgeoning. And what was it? You have intellectuals like Fernando Wanakuni, Mamani, David Choquehuanca talking about Buen Vivir. You have Eusebio Gironda talking about like anti-colonialist defenses of Evo Morales. You have Plurinationalidad. Bolivia, in some ways, was the first playground for Plurinacionalidad, and Evo Morales. And I think the one important thing is that he isn't consolidating in just in Bolivia. He has his organization RUNASUR, that is trying to spread plurinacionalidad across Latin America. So it essentially, Evo Morales is trying to expand indigenous and leftist Latin American culture across Latin America, and I think that shows some of the both the internationalism that he learned, but as well as the intellectualism that he's like, as well as like the conditions that he sees as right to spread plurinacionalidad, as well as the the specific leftist economic policies that are being passed, which I would love to get into, but I'm not sure there's much time about that.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say there's a lot of things that you brought up, especially I think the one thing that we, sadly it's kind of been a male dominated conversation in terms of
that's true.
The not just us talking, but also dudes talking, but also the intellectual tradition that we're talking about. And you brought up some, indigenous thinkers, indigenous women thinkers and revolutionaries, and I just want to open an invitation. I want to keep an open invitation to you, to come back on the show to talk about these things. Wonderful. Because, this has like been so eye opening for me that I just have so many questions, but also it's a challenge, for us in the North to really, not be so conceited in the sense of looking just at what we can gain within the kind of national politics of empire, whether it's Canada or the United States, but really to take to look beyond the kind of limitations of those politics and really look for inspiration, in places like Bolivia. When I went, it was very inspiring, not just the fact that you'd walk down the street and you would see indigenous people, but you walk into government buildings, you walk into, stores, you walk, anywhere you go, and there's indigenous people, but there's also indigenous culture. And it might seem like, oh, that's just representational politics. That's, that's not real. That's symbolic. But there's an intangible aspect of this. There's a spiritual aspect of this that you can't really just put a number on or say like, oh, well, this is what it means, or that it's just, it's just a kind of like cynical way to represent indigenous people, because it's like if you look around this country, if you look around, Minnesota, where I'm calling you from, it's like Minnesota has our language, Minnesota, which means the water that reflects, the sunlight into the clouds. It has much deeper.
That's super poetic.
Yeah, esoteric name, and it's very beautiful. And this is the origin place of Dakota people, my people originally. But, look what they've done with the place. They created this kind of like, they tried to create Europe here, and they genocided us. And that to me it's a hellhole. And so when I go to, a Pueblo del Casa, or the Casa del Pueblo, in La Paz, and I see a giant mural that's not just reflective of Amauta and Quechua people, but all indigenous people and cultures in, this ministry, that houses all the public ministries. And I see that, and I see this, this pride and this reverence for the Huipala, which is more, it's not a flag, it's a sacred symbol. And, I see people like giving offerings to Pachamama before everything, like we do every time Lakota and Dakota people get together. When we say pray, it's not really pray. It's, when we say prayer, we say mochekie, which actually means to greet a relative. Christians came in and said, oh, we're praying, but it's, we haven't, it's an introduced concept. And so we're literally just making relatives. And so every time I would listen to them, hold up the 3 coca leaves and say a prayer, it was, it meant something to me. And, I was like, there's a deeper meaning here. It's not just, you can't just provide, the Plurinational Project has provided food and has provided, sustenance for people, because at the end of the day, you can't eat ideology. Yeah. But at the same time, it's given people like a sense of pride and culture to grasp onto that you simply can't really quantify, and seeing the Huipalaso, when they came down, the millions came down in defense of the Huipala. Like I can't describe that to anybody. Like I've never seen anything like that in my entire life, and it wasn't just a political demonstration. It was a cultural and spiritual demonstration as well.
I think that, like, what was it? I always want to hit this point across for a lot of people, but the movements that you see in Latin America, both the land reforms, as well as the move towards plurinationality, those should be studied heavily by Native peoples in North America, because that's the future for North America happening in real time or having happened in the past. Many Native peoples now are trying to fight for treaty rights. They're trying to fight for land back and treaty rights. Now, I get why people like criticize the NGO aspects of it, but of course the fight for land back isn't just an NGO like fabricated fight. But like a lot of the land reforms and were completed, and indigenous people still found movements that needed to happen. Even with plurinacionalidad, the fight still hasn't been completed, even in Bolivia or Ecuador. Or
there was a coup,
and it certainly won't be in Chile too. Like once they have their plurinational constitution, probably this year or maybe next year.
Yeah, they killed Berta Cáceres. They overthrew Evo Morales. They are going after Jaime Vargas, the former leader of CONAI. These aren't just like...
In Peru, they actually stopped... they were supposed to have the RUNASUR meeting, which is actually a play on words from UNASUR, which is a South American economic bloc. But the Congress in Peru, which is an obstructionist right-wing government... Gee, I wonder where I've seen obstructionist right-wingers here. What other country? But they actually made Evo Morales a persona non grata to keep him from entering the country, to make it a legal offense, because they're worried that his movement would consolidate indigenous peoples in Peru and actually create a plurinational constitution. These are ideas that are indigenous peoples and the fight for plurinationality is far along, but it's still being contested by right wing and the colonial forces. And I think this in some ways is the experiment ground. This is a history book being written for indigenous peoples in the North. It shows strategies, it shows movements, it shows ways of consolidation, and it shows an actual future for what's ahead. That maybe you do have honored the treaties, and maybe you do have land back completed or on its process in North America in the next few years. Who knows? But then you'll see some of the hiccups that happen, and you'll wonder, I wish we had known something. I wish we had known how to resolve these problems before, when that history is the history of indigenous Latin America.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you joining the show, Arnold. And can you tell folks where they can find your work and how best they can support what you're doing?
So yeah, just follow me on New Amauta, Newaamauta, on Instagram. I love spelling stuff out just because I know some people love that type of help. Um, but and then follow me on Amauta New or New Amauta on Twitter. It's at Amauta New. I don't know why it reversed, but it is what it is. So just follow me on Instagram and Twitter, where um, I sometimes I get into beef, but it's mainly educational material. And even in when I do those online debates, it's always with the point of trying to educate people with very succinct and specific knowledge, stuff that you can research, names, books, authors, historical events, because we need to have the history rewritten where we know, like, it has to be rewritten and consolidated around an international indigenous perspective, a fourth world perspective, in George Manuel's words. Um, and honestly, it was just an honor to be here and to actually to hear such kind compliments. So, Pachi, thank you.